This is the story of a man who lost an empire and a woman who had nothing but a name, and how they found a kingdom together in the heart of a frozen wilderness. It's a tale that proves that a person's true fortune isn't what they own, but what they refuse to lose. If you believe in second chances and in a love that can thaw the coldest winter, then hit that like button and settle in. And when we're done, drop a comment below and tell me what you think is the true measure of a person's worth. Now, let's go back to a time when honor was a man's only currency and see what happens when he's declared bankrupt. Jasper Thorne once commanded boardrooms and owned cattle on 1,000 hills. His name was a signature that could move mountains of gold. Then, in the space of a single orchestrated lie, it was all gone. The lie, whispered by his most trusted partner, Marcus Blackwood, spread like a plague, turning his fortune to ash and his name to poison. Now all he owned was the threadbare coat on his back and a silence as deep and cold as the Montana winter. He stood on the splintered platform of the desolate train station in Prospect Creek, a town that was little more than a scar on the landscape. The cold came for him like a creditor, relentless and personal, seeping through the worn wool of his coat and settling deep in his bones. It was a cold that matched the one in his soul. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He was just there. Watching the tracks disappear into the white horizon was a ritual, a way to mark the passing of another day in his exile. The world he once ruled now only reached him through this thin iron artery, a world that had forgotten him completely. A memory, sharp as a shard of ice, pierced the dull ache of his present. Marcus, his face a mask of feigned regret, testifying before a panel of stony-faced investors. "A catastrophic misjudgment," Marcus had said, his voice dripping with false sorrow. Jasper's ambition simply outpaced his integrity. The words were a hangman's noose, and Jasper had been swinging from them ever since. The distant wail of a locomotive whistle sliced through the frozen air. It was a mournful, lonely sound that echoed the hollowness inside him. The train, a black serpent breathing smoke and steam, materialized from the snow-swept distance, growing larger and louder until it shuddered to a halt before the small station. Its arrival was the day's only event, a brief and noisy intrusion into the town's frozen stillness. A few bundled figures disembarked, a fur trapper, a family heading further west, their faces pinched and grim against the cold. They hurried away, heads bowed against the wind. Jasper watched them with detached indifference. They were ghosts from a life he no longer lived. Then the final passenger stepped down. She was a ghost of a different kind. She stood alone on the platform, a small, solitary figure in a dark, simple dress, utterly inadequate for the brutal mountain climate. She was young, no more than 18, with hair as black as polished jet, and a face of delicate porcelain beauty that seemed impossibly fragile in this harsh, unforgiving place. She clutched a single small carpet bag to her chest as if it contained all she had in the world. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, scanned the platform, searching for a face that wasn't there. A flicker of hope in them died, extinguished by the biting wind. Her name was An Lee, though Jasper did not know it yet. He only saw a girl, abandoned and alone, shivering not just from the cold, but from the sudden, terrifying realization that she had reached the end of the line in more ways than one. He saw the precise moment her carefully constructed composure began to crack. The subtle tremor in her hands, the way her gaze darted from the empty platform to the indifferent face of the station agent, who had already turned his back to retreat into the warmth of his office. She was a world away from home, a solitary candle flame in a blizzard, and the wind was rising. An Lee took a tentative step, then another, her thin shoes offering no protection from the frozen planks of the platform. The cold was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole her breath and turned her limbs to lead. The people who had promised her a new life, a position as a nurse for the town doctor, were not there. The entire town seemed empty, a collection of gray buildings huddled under a gray sky. There was only the wind and the looming, snow-dusted mountains that looked like the teeth of a wolf. She stood there for a long time, a statue of abandoned hope. Jasper watched from the shadows of the station overhang, a silent observer to her silent collapse. Every instinct screamed at him to stay hidden. To be seen was to be judged. To help was to invite questions he couldn't answer. He was a pariah, the disgraced cattle baron living on scraps, and his charity was worth less than nothing. It would only taint her, draw the town's suspicion onto them both. Let someone else help. The station agent, the blacksmith whose forge glowed orange down the street. But no one moved. They saw what he saw, a foreigner, a problem, someone else's burden. The cold was winning. He could see the violent shivers that racked her small frame, the blue tint that crept into her lips. She swayed, a delicate reed in the wind. Her bag slipped from her numb fingers and landed softly in the dusting of snow. Her eyes, wide and frightened, briefly met his across the platform. There was no plea in them, only a dawning, desolate surrender. Then, with a quiet sigh that was lost in the wind, she crumpled. She fell not with a crash, but with a slow, graceful folding, as if the cold had finally dissolved the bones within her. She lay still on the platform, a small, dark shape against the encroaching white of the world. Something inside Jasper broke. It was the last, rusted chain of his apathy. He moved before he could think, the ghost of the decisive man he used to be taking command of his frozen limbs. He crossed the platform in a dozen long strides, his worn boots thudding against the wood. A few faces appeared in the windows of the general store, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He ignored them. He knelt beside her. Her skin was like ice. Her breathing was shallow, a faint, fluttering pulse of life. He gathered her into his arms. She was shockingly light, a bird with broken wings. He pulled his coat tighter around her, a futile gesture against the savage cold, and stood up. The weight of her in his arms was a strange and unfamiliar burden. It was not the weight of responsibility for wealth or power, but something far more fundamental. It was the weight of a life. He turned and walked away from the station, away from the accusing silence of the train and the prying eyes of the town. He carried her through the single, muddy street of Prospect Creek, his head held high for the first time in months. He didn't have a home, not really, but he had shelter. He kicked open the door to the stables, the smell of hay and horse a familiar comfort, and climbed the rickety stairs to the small room he rented in the loft. The room was sparse, containing only a cot, a small table, and a pot-bellied stove. It was his entire world. He laid her gently on the cot, covering her with his own thin blanket. His hands, clumsy from the cold and disuse, worked to build up the fire in the stove until a welcome warmth began to seep into the frigid air. He pulled a chair to the side of the cot and sat, watching the slow, fragile return of life to her face, a strange, forgotten sense of purpose stirring in the ruins of his heart. Anli awoke to the smell of wood smoke and the soft crackle of a fire. For a moment she was suspended between the freezing nightmare of the platform and the quiet warmth of this small, sparse room. A man sat in a chair by her cot, his face shadowed, his posture still. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She pushed herself up, her muscles aching in protest. The man didn't move, but his voice, when he spoke, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "You're safe. You collapsed at the station. He gestured to a tin cup of steaming water on the table beside her. "Drink this." She took the cup, her hands still trembling, and sipped the hot water. It chased some of the chill from her bones. She looked at him more closely now. He was not old, perhaps 30, but his face was etched with lines of hardship that made him seem ancient. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, held a weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. They were the eyes of a man who had seen his world burn down. In careful, precise English, honed by years of study at the mission in San Francisco, she told him her story. She was a nurse. A letter had arrived, bearing a seal from a Dr. Alastair Finch in Prospect Creek, offering her a position with a handsome wage and passage paid. It was a chance for a new life, away from the crowded, often cruel streets of the city. She showed him the letter. Jasper took the paper, his expression grim. "Dr. Finch died of influenza a month ago," he said, his voice flat. "There is no position. I'm sorry." The words hung in the air between them. An Lee felt the last of her hope crumble to dust. A cruel trick, a forged letter. She was penniless, alone, and trapped. A quiet tear traced a path down her cheek. In her despair, Jasper saw a reflection of his own ruin, the same bitter taste of betrayal. He had been ruined by a lie, and so had she. He cleared his throat. "I have nothing," he began, the words stark and honest. "This room, a few dollars, a land claim that's mostly rock, and ambition. But I'm trying to build a horse ranch. I need help. You need shelter." He looked at her directly, his gaze unwavering. "I can't pay you a wage, not yet, but I can offer you a roof, food, and my protection. You can work for your keep." And so began their strange and silent partnership. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by survival. Jasper would rise before dawn, the cold in the loft so bitter it felt like a physical blow, and head out to the small parcel of land he had claimed at the edge of town. There, with a stubbornness that bordered on madness, he was attempting to tame the wild, wind-swept acreage into something that could support a handful of horses. He worked with a grim, relentless fury, his hands raw, his body aching, pouring all his frustration and loss into the unforgiving earth. An Lee, in turn, brought a quiet order to his chaotic existence. She transformed the small, dusty loft into a semblance of a home. She mended his worn clothes with neat, almost invisible stitches, cooked nourishing meals from their meager supplies, and kept the fire stoked against the relentless cold. Her presence was a silent, steadying force. She was a nurse to her core, and she saw in him a patient as much as a benefactor. His body was a map of his past life, old injuries from his ranching days that ached in the cold, new cuts and bruises from his daily labor. She treated them with poultices made from herbs she found on the sheltered slopes of the hills, her touch gentle but firm, her manner professional and distant. A quiet respect grew in the space between them. He was astonished by her resilience. She never complained, never spoke of the life she had lost or the future that had been stolen from her. She simply worked, her small hands as capable and determined as his own. She, in turn, began to see past the town's caricature of the ruined baron. She saw the pride that wouldn't let him break, the flicker of kindness in his guarded eyes, the unwavering integrity in his dealings, even when he had nothing to gain. The town, however, saw only scandal. "Thorne and his Chinese girl," the whispers went in the general store, the saloon. Their arrangement was deemed improper, suspicious. The women of the town clutched their shawls tighter and pulled their children close when An Lee passed, their faces hard with judgment. The men snorted with derision, seeing Jasper's fall as complete, now shacked up with a foreign woman in a stable loft. The isolation that had once been Jasper's alone now enveloped them both, binding them together in a shared exile. The turning point came not with a grand gesture, but with the desperate cry of a mother in the dead of night. The blacksmith, a burly, hard-handed man named Peterson, had a young son, barely 6 years old, who was wasting away from a fever that had raged for 3 days. The new town doctor, a nervous young man with more book learning than practical skill, had pronounced it a lost cause. He had shaken his head, offered his condolences, and left. In her grief and desperation, Mrs. Peterson remembered the whispers. She remembered seeing An Lee gathering herbs by the creek, her movements precise and knowing. Clutching a lantern against the swirling snow, she made her way to the stables and hammered on the door. "Please," she begged when Jasper opened it, her face streaked with tears. "They say she knows medicine. My boy, he's burning up." An Lee appeared behind Jasper, her expression calm and serious. She asked a few quiet questions about the boy's symptoms, her voice steady in the face of the woman's frantic sobs. Then, without a word to Jasper, she gathered a small bundle of dried herbs and followed Mrs. Peterson out into the storm. For 2 days and 2 nights, An Lee did not leave the boy's side. She bathed him in cool water, forced sips of a bitter herbal tea between his cracked lips, and spoke to him in a low, soothing tone, a mixture of English and her native tongue. She met the skepticism of the father and the hovering anxiety of the mother with an unshakable professional calm. Jasper brought her food and fresh water, standing at the doorway of the small house like a silent sentinel. He watched her work, marveling at the authority and compassion she commanded. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. The boy woke, his eyes clear and his voice weak but his own, asking for his mother. The news spread through Prospect Creek like a wildfire. An Lee was no longer just Thorne's girl. She was the woman who had saved the blacksmith's son when the doctor had given up. A fragile seed of respect had been planted in the town's frozen ground. People began to nod at her in the street. A few of the women would offer a hesitant smile. They brought her small gifts, a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, as payment for advice on a cough or a poultice for an aching joint. Her quiet competence had given them a foothold in the community, and through her, the town began to see Jasper not as a disgrace, but as the man who had sheltered a miracle. Just as the first hints of a thaw began to touch the edges of their solitary lives, the architect of Jasper's ruin rode into town. Marcus Blackwood arrived not in a puff of smoke, but on a magnificent black stallion, his saddle trimmed in silver, his coat made of the finest wool. He was charisma given form, his smile broad and easy, his handshake firm. He dismounted in front of the saloon, greeting the town mayor and the sheriff as if they were old friends, his booming laughter echoing down the street. He was the picture of success, the living embodiment of everything Jasper had lost. News of Jasper's unlikely survival had reached him, an irritating loose end he had come personally to tie off. He found Jasper at his fledgling ranch, wrestling a fence post into the half-frozen ground. Marcus sat casually on his horse, looking down at Jasper's dirt-stained clothes and calloused hands, with an expression of pity that was more insulting than any sneer. "Jasper, my old friend," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "I heard you'd fallen on hard times, but I never imagined this. It's a sad sight." Jasper straightened up slowly, his face an unreadable mask. "What do you want, Marcus?" Marcus's smile widened. "I came to help, of course. This pastoral fantasy is beneath you. I want to buy your claim. Name your price. Think of it as a severance, a final gesture of our old friendship." The offer was an insult wrapped in charity, designed to publicly underscore Jasper's desperation. "My land isn't for sale," Jasper said, his voice low and even. Just then, An Lee came out of the small, half-finished cabin they had begun to build, carrying a bucket of water. Marcus's eyes slid over to her, his gaze lingering with an owner's appraisal. "Ah, and this must be the companion I've heard whispers about," he said, his tone turning oily. "Still picking up strays, I see. A commendable, if foolish, habit." An Li met his gaze without flinching, her dark eyes filled with a quiet, powerful contempt that momentarily startled him. The confrontation was set. The man who had everything had come to crush the man who had nothing left to lose. Marcus, rebuffed by Jasper's quiet defiance, changed his tactics. He set about poisoning the town's fragile, newfound respect for the couple. In the saloon, over rounds of whiskey he paid for, he retold the story of Jasper's downfall, embellishing it with new, more damning details. He painted Jasper as a reckless gambler who had not only lost his own fortune, but had squandered the life savings of widows and orphans. He was a charming, convincing liar, and the old suspicions in the town began to resurface like weeds after a spring rain. Store owners who had recently offered Jasper credit suddenly found their ledgers full. Men who had nodded a greeting now looked away. Marcus's power was not just in his wealth, but in his ability to manipulate reputation, the most valuable currency in a small town. He approached An Li at the general store, cornering her between a barrel of flour and a stack of canned goods. "A woman of your talents and beauty is wasted here," he said, his voice a low purr. "This town, this man, they have nothing to offer you. I, on the other hand, could provide you with a comfortable life in a city, a real life." He was offering her a gilded cage, assuming her loyalty, like everything else, had a price. An Li looked at him, her expression as still and clear as winter water. "A man's worth is in his hands and his heart," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You have neither." She walked past him, leaving him standing amidst the scent of cinnamon and his own simmering fury. But something had fundamentally shifted in Prospect Creek. When Marcus tried to enlist the sheriff to find a legal loophole to seize Jasper's land claim, the sheriff, whose own daughter An Li had treated for croup, found endless bureaucratic delays. When Marcus's hired men tried to intimidate Jasper, the blacksmith, Peterson, appeared with two of his stoutest apprentices, their hammers held loosely in their hands, and suggested they move along. The small acts of kindness they had sown were now yielding a harvest of loyalty. The people An Li had healed, the families who had witnessed Jasper's back-breaking labor and unwavering integrity, formed a quiet, unbreachable wall around them. They had judged Jasper and An Li not by the lies of a rich man, but by the truth of their character. The final confrontation took place not in a dusty street at high noon, but on the steps of the town hall. Marcus, enraged by the town's resistance, had called a public meeting, intending to use his influence and rhetoric to turn the community against Jasper once and for all, and force him out. He stood on the top step, a figure of authority, and began his speech, his voice ringing with practiced sincerity as he detailed Jasper's alleged crimes. Jasper and An Li stood at the edge of the crowd, watching him. They were not alone. The Peterson family was there, as was the store owner, the sheriff, and a dozen other faces that had once been hostile or indifferent, but were now resolute. When Marcus finished, a triumphant smirk on his face, Jasper walked calmly through the crowd. He held not a weapon, but a packet of letters tied with a simple string. "You're a fine storyteller, Marcus," Jasper said, his voice steady and carrying to every corner of the square. "But I have a story of my own." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply began to read. The letters were from a man named Arthur Vance, a former clerk in Marcus's main office. Vance, consumed by guilt, had written a full confession before disappearing. The letters, which Jasper had spent months tracking down through a contact in San Francisco, detailed the systematic fraud Marcus had perpetrated. The forged ledgers, the fake accounts, the deliberate sabotage of investments, all designed to bankrupt Jasper and allow Marcus to seize control of their shared assets. He had proof, cold, undeniable proof in black and white. A stunned silence fell over the crowd as Jasper read the final, damning sentence. The sheriff stepped forward, his face grim. Marcus Blackwood, for the first time in his life, was speechless. His power, built entirely on a scaffolding of lies and reputation, collapsed in an instant. There was no bluster, no fight. He simply turned, his face pale and slack, and walked through the silent, parting crowd to his horse. He rode out of Prospect Creek without a backward glance, a man erased by the truth. Jasper stood on the steps, the letters in his hand, with An Lee beside him. His name was his own again. The departure of Marcus Blackwood was like the breaking of a long, hard winter. As the first true thaws of spring arrived, melting the deep snow and turning the frozen creeks into rushing streams of clear, cold water, a new season began for Jasper and An Lee as well. The cloud of disgrace that had hung over Jasper for so long finally dissipated, leaving behind the hard-won respect of a community that had seen his true character. The whispers were replaced by friendly greetings, the suspicion by offers of help. Men from the town came out to his ranch on their day off, helping him raise the final walls of his barn. The women brought seeds for a garden for An Lee, sharing knowledge of which crops would survive the short mountain growing season. Their small cabin, once a symbol of their isolation, became a place of warmth and welcome. The ranch began to thrive. The horses Jasper broke and trained were known for their strength and gentle temperament, and his reputation as an honest horseman spread to the neighboring valleys. An Lee, with the town's support, established a proper infirmary in a small room off the general store, her quiet skill becoming an essential part of the community's fabric. They were no longer exiles. They were founders. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, they stood on the porch of their cabin, looking out at the land they had tamed together. The air was soft with the scent of pine and damp earth. Jasper turned to An Lee, taking her hand. His was rough and calloused from work. Hers was fine-boned but strong. "I had nothing when you arrived," he said, his voice quiet. "Less than nothing." She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the fading light. "We had nothing," she corrected gently. "And we built this." In the heart of the Wild West, their story became a quiet legend, not a tale of gunslingers or gold strikes, but of a disgraced millionaire and a forsaken nurse who, in the depths of the coldest winter, found in each other the resilience to rebuild a life and the courage to forge a love that made its own kind of history. It was a legacy built not on what was lost, but on the enduring strength of what was found.